Hello and welcome. This is Lisa Koss along with David White. We are principals of Ontos Global. We are delighted to have you with us for this webinar. The topic is how leaders create high-performing teams. Leading teams is a fundamental skill set for people leaders and often a big mystery. There's no adequate guidebook to navigate for many leaders on how to turn a collection of individual people into a team who can get great work done in an environment that feels good, that has trust and support, and is a positive place to be. You've probably heard the expression, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But that's actually incorrect in a lot of cases. And so instead of that, what's actually more true is the whole is different than the sum of its parts. What leaders can take from that is that there's a lot that they can do to either make a successful team or a less successful team, and what they need to do needs to change over time. David's going to take you through a presentation that talks about that fact. What can leaders do to create a high-performing team, and what needs to change over time as the team progresses?
Thank you, Lisa. And for some of you, this might be a bit of a review, and for some of you, this will be brand new material. But in all cases, to Lisa's point, especially in this time of pandemics and global disruption that most organizations face, these skills and these mindsets that we're going to be talking about in this presentation are more important than ever. And leadership in times of leadership is hard enough, but in particular times of stress like this, it's more important than ever. And how to create high-performing teams remains for many people, an elusive goal. So hopefully this podcast will help you with some ideas and demystify some of these mysteries. So we polled one of our leadership cohorts on what makes a team effective or less effective. And we're very happy to show the results of that poll here on this slide. And what's clear as you look through some of these results is that it's encouraging that many of our leaders, at least the ones in the program, one of our programs, see that a lot of what makes teams effective are not just hard skills like having a common purpose and goals, but items like sharing experience and being vulnerable, or listening and understanding, or having mutual respect. It's nice to see some of these softer skills, so-called softer skills, make the list of what's very important. And this is obviously a fairly diverse list. But you can also think about this list in terms of what leaders do in terms of input and what happens as a result of what they do, or in terms of output. Or another way of saying that is, what does the leader of any group actually impact in terms of what a group or how a group is effective? And if you look at the orange on this slide, you can see that for the most part, the leader has direct impact on most of these items. Obviously, the leader plays a key role in setting vision and purpose, encouraging shared experience and vulnerability, creating structure, listening, understanding different views, leveraging diversity, etc. Some of these items, the ones in blue, the leader may not have direct control or impact over, because, for example, motivation for people may be elusive. It's hard to see in all cases how a leader can tell someone how to become motivated. They may have a role in it, but they may not. Trust is typically thought of as an output versus an input. There are many things that a leader can do to create trust, but it's not a straight formula. But for the most part, what the leader does in creating an effective team is highly important. And you can see from this slide that the leader impacts quite a bit. So the question then comes down to is how do you do that? How do leaders create a high performing team? And so on this slide, we see a very cute baby being held by an adult's hands. And the question then is, what does this cute baby and these hands have to do with creating a high performing team? It turns out that this particular picture and what happens to children with their mothers or fathers is actually is an analog to what happens with groups, which we're going to explore. So here's the thing. When you ignore what is really going on in a group at the emotional and psychological levels of a group, you do so at your peril. When leaders ignore what is really happening in groups, this is what will keep groups underachieving. In any group, you have what we call the task. The task is, of course, what's the purpose of the group? It's the deliverables, it's the output, it's why the group is constituted to begin with. All groups, all organizations, all divisions have a purpose. They're convened and they're organized into a group for a purpose. That purpose is a business-oriented task. At the same time, there's something else going on. And all of us who've been part of groups, and that includes everyone, knows that in any group, there's also another reality at play, which is what we call the emotional and psychological reality, or the group process level. Because every group has humans in it, and humans have emotions, and these emotions manifest in groups, especially in brand new groups. I only need to remind you of your first day in one of our leadership programs to have you recall those particular feelings that you might have had in being with a group of strangers, or at least in a room full of people whom you only may have known a few. We normally call this anxiety. When people come into groups, into new groups, they naturally feel anxiety. This is a natural human emotion of being around strangers or people you don't know well. And what happens in groups that becomes very important for the leader to pay attention to is how to deal with or manage this anxiety. Anxiety, as said, it's a normal part of any group. There's always a lot of it in the early stages of group formation. And so the leader's job is to become aware of this and successfully manage or deal with the anxiety in a productive way for the group. And that's what we're going to explore. When anxiety is not dealt with adequately, these things tend to happen. Three psychodynamic or psychological phenomena happen: dependence, fight, flight, or pairing. Dependence is a natural result of unresolved anxiety where the group members become overly dependent on the leader. They wait for the leader to tell them what to do. They wait for direction. They wait for vision. They wait. Sometimes that dependence also manifests as focusing exclusively on the task at the expense of everything else. This is the person who gets very, very involved in carrying out the deliverables to the letter of the law, but forgets the fact that there are other people in the group and forgets that there are other relationships and other phenomena that need to be attended to. Fight, flight, as the name implies, has to do with either, is a form of resistance. Obviously, in modern organizations, we don't see too much actual fighting or people running out of the building screaming, but fighting can manifest as resisting, as arguing, as being passive-aggressive. Flight can manifest as checking out, emotionally checking out, being very quiet, being bored, not engaged. These are natural resistance behaviors and natural ways of dealing with anxiety. Pairing is a very common form of anxiety mitigation, whereby you connect with or pair with someone that you know in the group, and groups as such form little sub-cliques or subgroups that become potentially divisive of the groups, because now the group subdivides into small groups based on unresolved anxiety. So these three things, dependence, fight, flight, and pairing, are common ways in which groups deal with anxiety. The task of the leader is to be aware of this, recognize it, and do something about it. Otherwise, groups will forever stay in this underachieving place. So what does the leader do? Well, the easiest way to explain this, going back to our picture of the baby, is to think about the leader's number one job in creating a high functioning group or team is to create what we call a holding environment. Holding environment is a term right out of psychology, out of developmental psychology. It was invented by the notable child psychologist D.W. Winnicott in the 1950s. And it has to do with creating an environment where someone can feel safe. It's a very basic concept. It's a very basic law of human development. In the group context, holding environments are about allowing group members to feel safe and secure so that they can be themselves. So why do we care about people being themselves in groups? Well, because when you feel more comfortable and you are more, quote unquote, yourself, you do better work. You're more engaged, you're more fulfilled, and generally when you do better work, groups tend to achieve higher levels of performance and tend to be more generative, meaning they give more to other people and they provide an environment that is much more nurturing and fulfilling for most people. So this idea of a holding environment becomes really important for leaders to understand and to figure out how to achieve and how to attain. So let's look at actually how this happens. One of the psychological phenomena of group development is that groups naturally have 3 stages in which they go through to attain high performance. Now, an important point on this is that these stages are natural ways of basically resolving anxiety, or to put more simply, when groups feel less anxious, they move or progress to the next stage. And again, back to our concept of anxiety and our concept of holding environments, the leader's job is to help groups resolve their anxiety as efficiently and quickly as possible. So what do we mean by anxiety, and what do these stages actually look like? In any new group, the basic questions that need to be dealt with are in this first stage that we call the dependent stage. It's called the dependent stage because there is dependency on the leader. And these are basic questions that everyone has in any new social environment or a group. They're questions of, who am I? Who are you? Who are we? What do I mean by who am I? Well, it's particularly, who am I in this group? Can I be me? Can I show up as me? Or do I have to play a role? Do I have to have a facade? Do I have to play a persona? Do I have to play the game? Or can I really kind of show up with being myself as much as possible? And this is a source of a lot of anxiety. Again, anybody who's been in any new social situation recalls that this is a very common feeling. Similarly, you also have questions about your other group members. Who are you? Will you recognize me? Will you like me? Will you challenge me? Do I need to be defensive around you? Do I need to hide parts of myself in order to get along with you? Right? So who are you, not just in the sense of your name and rank and serial number, but who are you really, and can I trust you? And thirdly, who is the leader? Right? Not only who is the leader, we know who the leader is nominally, but what's the leader about? What does she care about? What does she really want? Will she be able to see me? Will I be able to trust her? And lastly, what are the rules? What are we doing here in this group? What are the norms? What's in, what's out? What are the conventions? And again, can I abide by them? So these are the major questions that need to be resolved at stage 1. When leaders don't adequately resolve these questions, the groups forever stay in stage 1. So to put it simply, what the leader is trying to do in stage 1 is help the group resolve enough these questions so that they can move to the next stage. So how do they do that? So what leaders do to create high functioning teams at stage 1 is called the 3 C's: contracting, or contract, contact, and clarity. These are a set of behaviors and a set of orientations that help leaders, that help groups process their anxiety effectively at stage 1 and help them move to stage 2. Some of this will sound very obvious and straightforward for most of you, for many of you, and some of this may be less straightforward for some people. Some of us are more comfortable doing some of these items on this list, and some of us are less comfortable doing some of these things. So let's look at each one. Contracting is the very basic act of establishing what the group is doing and not doing. We call that setting boundaries. What are we about? What's our vision? What's our purpose? What's our goal? Pretty straightforward. Contracting is also about establishing norms. What do we care about? What do we value? What do we not care about? How are we going to go about doing our work? What are sort of the rules of engagement for ourselves? And of course, defining roles. Most groups in modern organizations have already predefined roles, but sometimes those roles need to be actually clarified. On project teams, for example, or in virtual teams, sometimes it's very important to clarify who is doing what. And sometimes that changes, who is doing what, when, and why. This is all contracting, and this is incredibly important psychologically for reducing anxiety. Contact is the set of behaviors and activities that have to do with establishing human-to-human contact that helps lessen anxiety and produce trust. This is an area for leaders that is often a little bit more elusive, a little more difficult than the contracting phase. Contact means encouraging actual contact between individuals. How do you do that? Through sharing, by being open. This is why groups, when they do team building, often start with activities related to focusing on history or focusing on what people have done prior to being employed by the particular company, or sharing personal stories. Contact is very, very important for groups to start to feel trust among each other. Contact also has to do with surfacing concerns. So as individuals bring up particular wants or needs or anxieties or concerns, the leader proactively negotiates those, proactively encourages them, sort of asks people to share, and models that. Again, the purpose is to establish real human-to-human contact. As people say things that may be a little controversial or a little bit different, or express a motivation or express a need or express any kind of an issue, the leader's job at stage 1 is very much to legitimize that. So what we mean by legitimizing individuals, it really means not denying people the right to have their own expressions, their own experience. And as people express that, leaders at stage 1 encourage that. They don't shut it down. They don't squash people. They don't say, well, we don't do that around here, etc. And that all goes towards supporting risk-taking. The more people can take risks at stage 1, as long as those risks are not absolutely corrosive or detrimental to the group, and of course that's a judgment call, but the more that risk-taking can be encouraged, the faster trust and contact are enabled. And again, the leader's job here is really to support risk-taking as much as possible in these early stages. Clarity, as the name implies, is a lot about consistency. It's basically being consistent in your actions as a leader, clarifying your intentions. When you do something, do you state why you're doing it? And do you state what's the purpose behind my behavior or my interest or my strategy or my opinion here? What is your intention? And also helping others clarify their intentions. When people say something, what's behind that, right? You're trying to sort of make clear or make transparent what is unspoken. And the unspoken stuff can be related to motives, it can be related to intent, it can be related to rationale. Clarity is all about surfacing the subterranean stuff, the unspoken stuff. So to the extent that the leader is able to establish contact between groups and help with clarity, their own and others, these are the 3 sets of behaviors that are critical to helping groups progress through stage 1. We often get asked the question, so how do you know when you're out of stage 1 and into stage 2? And a lot of leaders think that their groups are at stage 2 when in fact they're still in stage 1. So it's important just to take a minute and just reflect on what are the indicators that groups are still in the first stage versus the second stage. Stage 1 groups are very much characterized by the items in the blue box here. They're often very, very polite, sort of, they say socially acceptable things in socially acceptable ways. This is very common in groups that don't know each other very well. They tend to be very deferential to each other and to the leader. They tend to be very much focused on the task. Stage 1 groups, you will often see strong bonds between people who have paired, but not necessarily strong bonds across the entire group. Pretty straightforward. One of the characteristics of stage 1 groups is that there's a lot of emotional processing that happens outside of the group. So what do we mean by that? You'll find people at the coffee station or the water cooler or at lunch talking about what's going on in the group, but only to each other and maybe within subgroups, versus actually talking about what's going on in the group itself. So sort of a lot of outside conversation. May not be a bad thing, but leaders want to encourage stuff that's being said about the group or about the leader or about any member of the group in the group itself. There's obviously a lot of dependence on the leader or the authority figure. Sometimes it could be the leader, sometimes it could be the expert. Sometimes it could be, as mentioned earlier, the task itself. People get very focused on task, forgetting that there are other humans in the group who have emotional needs that may need to be attended to. One of the surest ways you know you're in stage 1 is when you have a difference, when you feel like you disagree or have a difference of an opinion with something that's been said in the group or with the leader, but you don't express it. That's your surest sign that you're still in stage 1. You don't feel comfortable bringing a different opinion to the table or really sharing something that might be controversial or not perhaps the norm or a little deviant or just a little strange. So this is a sure sign that you're in stage 1. And some groups, the more corrosive groups, can demonstrate real passive aggressiveness, really defined as saying one thing within the group and then doing something completely different or counterproductive to the group outside the group. There are many, many leadership teams in organizations that really demonstrate that behavior excessively. And it's a sure sign that the group has not done the work and the leader has not done the work of helping the group feel comfortable or, in essence, created a holding environment. So stage 1, to summarize, is all about getting these questions resolved that are in the gray box, helping groups understand, helping individuals and groups understand who they are as individuals and as a group, and allowing themselves to sort of show up a little bit more comfortably. And when that happens, magically, what happens is groups move to stage 2. When these questions are resolved or resolved enough, groups tend to be able to move to stage 2. So you know you're in stage 2 basically when you feel as a group member that you can relax. It's quite simple actually, and we've all been in groups where we suddenly start to feel a little bit more ourselves. We don't have to quite be so anxious before every meeting or every conference call. We can start to feel a little bit more like a team. And this is the clear sign that you're kind of moving into stage 2. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Much like children who grow and parents who have to adjust to adjust to the children or the child as a child grows, as a child moves from one developmental stage into another, so with groups. Because as children or groups or humans in groups evolve, their needs evolve, and as they become more comfortable in a group, people will start to express themselves in freer, less constrained ways. They start to show up more as themselves. And this puts a real challenge on the leader to allow that to happen and allow that to happen in a productive way. Because at stage 2, needs evolve. And as needs evolve, the leadership task at stage 2 is about making the holding environment bigger. So another way of saying it very basically is, as people start to feel more comfortable and groups start to become more evolved at stage 2, can you, as the leader, flex to make the holding environment bigger? That can be challenging for leaders because they can often feel that this is a challenge to them and their authority. So let's look at this. Stage 2 groups, what happens in stage 2 groups is that the norms of the group start to be practiced. They're not just things on a piece of paper or on a PowerPoint. People start to live and practice the norms and start to openly challenge some of the other norms. And some norms that have been written down may not be actually practiced anymore, and people start to call that out. One of the most obvious characteristics of stage 2 groups is that people in the group start to challenge and express differences of opinion and or dissatisfaction, and they start to do so fairly openly. Because as people start to feel themselves, that means they can show up being a little bit different, and as people start to feel freer and show differences, whether it's differences of opinion or just differences of values, these differences can often be directed at the leader or the strategy or the task, and then sometimes that can result in conflict, or at least differences of opinion. The very important point is that these differences of opinion or these conflicts can be very productive and very developmental, provided that they're handled well, because this allows the group to feel more safe and more trusting. So one of the paradoxes of stage 2 and of leadership is that conflict generally is a good thing. Conflict generally is productive if it's handled well. What does that mean? Well, that means handled with skill and with some competence. It means you use some of the skills and techniques that we have been teaching in other in these programs, such as the 4 disciplines of a leader, or feedback models like situation, behavior, impact, and other communication and conflict management techniques that are effective in helping groups navigate conflict. We're not going to cover all of those here in detail, but again, I invite you to that material, to review that material if you have questions. These are ways of productively handling conflict, and the leader plays a key role in that. This idea of roles being differentiated from people or from persons is also a characteristic of stage 2 groups. This is where people start to be seen as real people, not as labels, not as roles or titles. So for example, the HR person on the leadership team, is entitled to have opinions about the go-to-market process or the marketing strategy or the product development strategy, and it's not just simply seen as an HR person. The salesperson may have an opinion about an operations or procurement process, and the people on the members of the team start to feel more interlocked or interlaced in terms of their ability to have opinions and show up not just as people in roles and boxes, but people with whom they have a vested interest in helping their team members. So as this starts to happen, you'll see that there's less sense of turf and silos, less, I thought you were in charge of sales, and how come you're, talking about this with me, and more interdependence as people start to solve challenges together. And when that happens, there's much more appreciation of diverse perspectives. And this also can apply not just to formal roles, but to informal roles. The person who's always been the note taker in the group, suddenly decides that they don't want to be seen as the administrator anymore, and they want to not take on that role. Does the leader allow that to happen? And are you able to separate out the fact that someone is in a role from the fact that someone is a real person with real needs and may not actually fully want to inhabit that role? So that's what that means. So in short, what leaders do at stage 2 is they surface or encourage differences of opinion. They're not threatened by differences of opinion or conflict, and then they actually work hard to bring it out. They recognize that roles are not the same as people, and people are complex creatures that have opinions and insights across the range of roles and activities, and that's encouraged. They call out the unspoken, whether it's norms or feelings. And most of all, leaders at stage 2 allow themselves to be comfortable being challenged. This is one of the most difficult things for leaders to recognize, is that conflict at stage 2, especially if it's directed at at the leader or the strategy is not necessarily counterproductive. In fact, it can be highly productive, highly productive. The other things to remember about these stages is that you don't get to stage 2 unless you've gone through stage 1. That may sound kind of obvious and kind of silly, but until you've resolved the anxieties and the needs at stage 1, you'll never get to stage 2. This also means that you can't force stage 2. I know some leaders who like to purposefully inject conflict and controversy into stage 1 groups in order to try to speed up the process of getting to stage 2. But you can't inject conflict or controversy or shake things up, as it were, at stage 1 unless the group feels safe enough at stage 1 to actually absorb and make use of that conflict or that controversy. So it's a fine balance between having enough safety, enough of a holding environment in stage 1 so that you can move to stage 2. But if you introduce conflict or controversy or try to shake things up too fast, you'll actually find yourself eroding trust and safety at stage 1. So you can't force stage 2. One last point here. A lot of what we're talking about here obviously has to do with human anxiety and human feelings. And whenever a new team member joins a group or someone leaves the team, you're always going back to stage 1. Why? Because to integrate any new member or to reform a group when people have left that group, you're having to deal again with all of those questions of identity. Who am I? Who are you? Who are we? What are we doing? Sometimes if the leader is very competent at the 3 C's, you can do that fairly quickly and move fairly quickly through that, but you still have to attend to dealing with those psychological realities. So a last word about stage 3. Stage 3 teams take time because once you have worked through stage 2, the counter-dependent stage, you get to what we call the interdependent stage. And this takes time, as said, and also is fairly rare in most organizations because, frankly, the turnover rate among groups is so high. People come and go, or restructurings, or project teams form and disband. So it's hard to have any continuity to actually get to this stage. As mentioned, it takes time. Sometimes that can take a whole year or 2 years, depending on what's happening. The other reason why stage 3 interdependence is a little bit rare is that leaders often have a hard time recognizing that a highly functioning, high-performing team, the leader will not be the ultimate authority. And in most traditional organizations, that's a message that's not reinforced. But in fact, stage 3 teams are really characterized by teams that can process new information very, very quickly. They're highly interdependent, high degrees of mutual trust and support. The relationships on the teams are seen as sources of strength and nurturance. They're highly sustaining. Another way of saying what stage 3 is all about is that a stage 3 team no longer feels like a team. It just feels like a collection of your close friends, close associates, and you just love working with them, and you feel almost as if you're one. Now, obviously, for many people, certainly in my experience, this is a pretty rare occurrence for the reasons already mentioned. The big lesson for leaders in stage 3, again, is that leaders are not the ultimate authority in groups like this. They may play a very key role, a key facilitation role, a key guidance role, a key mentoring role, a key coaching role, but the authority, the expertise, the processing is really coming from the group itself. The group mind is really able to be seen and felt. And again, in many traditional organizations, this kind of thinking about leadership is not very common. So that concludes our review of high-functioning teams and our discussion about how do you get through, how do you develop a high-functioning team by recognizing the natural anxieties that humans have in any group, and how these anxieties, once they get resolved, allow groups to progress emotionally and psychologically through different stages of development, and what leaders need to do to encourage that. So with that, I will say thank you and turn it back over to Lisa.
Okay, so we hope that you feel more informed about what leaders can do to not only build a team, help it be cohesive, and to recognize how it changes over time. And hopefully you also feel more empowered about what is it all about and how do you need to show up as a leader in order to help your team move in to a stage 3 behavior, hopefully. So I guess we would just have you, consider what stage is the team that you have in mind, what stage are they in, how are you reacting as a leader, and try to match that with what you've heard today. And get some feedback, share this information with your teams and see if you can educate them as well on these processes, because in that way you're all working on the same things together. So with that, thank you very much from Ontos, and we are happy to address you in this way. And take good care of yourselves and reach out if you have any questions at ontosglobal.com or give us a call.